project that she will be presenting today, although she has already done a more abbreviated version at the New York State Political Science Association conference this past weekend. But as you can see, it's beyond the nation state, examining trends and support for governments in the EU. Certainly, if you've read the papers these days, you know that what's going on in Europe is certainly drawing a lot of attention. And I think that Sharon's piece raises some not only important insights, but important questions for us to understand going forward. So without further ado, please over to Sharon.
Thank you, and thank you guys for being here. I kind of got interested in the European Union and what was going on there while I was spending a semester abroad in London last spring, my junior year. I spent about 4 months, and there's a lot of negative opinion towards the European Union and any kind of united Europe in London and in Britain in general. And I kind of wanted to look at why that's a big deal and what kind of impact that's having on Europe as a state. It's trying to be kind of this supranational governing body that has some form of power over nation states, and if the citizens of those nation states don't necessarily like it, what does that do to its functionality? So I was actually originally going to do this project as part of one of my requirements for a class when I was in London, until I realized how much I didn't know about the European Union. So I'll give you guys just kind of a brief background of what the EU is and why it's come to be what it is today before I go into what my actual paper was on. So this is the European Union, and as you can see, it's most of Europe. There are 27 nations in the European Union. That one little white spot in the middle is Switzerland. They don't like to be part of a lot of things, including the EU. And so I guess the most visible part of the European Union that most people think of is the euro. And that's the unified currency that all of Europe uses, or most of Europe uses. Actually, only 17 of the 27 nation states in the EU use the euro. The euro is part of a different body called the European Monetary Union. And those are the countries that use the euro. The euro has different entry requirements than the European Union. The European Union, basically, the two biggest entry requirements is that a country has to have some kind of representative government. So it has to be some form of a democracy, small d democracy, not big D. And then it also has to portray some kind of Europeanness. So what that exactly means is still kind of in the process of being defined. But those are the two major requirements for that. In terms of the EMU, the European Monetary Union, there's a lot of laws based on how much of a country's GDP is taken up by debt, or how much unemployment it has, stuff like that. So actually the US would not be able to be a part of the EMU because of our debt. So some of the nations in the European Union want to be part of the EMU but can't because of those situations, and other nations like Britain are definitely able to be part of the EMU but don't want to be. They opt out of it for a variety of reasons. So this is kind of Europe, and the European Union came into existence at the end of World War II. It didn't really become what it is today until the early 1990s, but right after World War II is when people started getting pretty serious about forming a united Europe. You had World War I, which is started in Europe, and then conditions from World War I arguably set the stage for World War II. And so after World War II, Europe was pretty much in shambles. They had no infrastructure, they had lost a generation of their population, and they didn't want this to happen again. So a unified Europe was a way to keep that from happening again. And also, it was a way to help Europe recover economically, because each individual European country is pretty small. And right after World War II, you had these two superpowers, the USSR and the US, and Europe was kind of in the middle, and they needed to compete economically somehow. And to do that, they kind of had to unify. So that's kind of the rationale behind the EU. There's a lot more nuance in there, but just kind of a brief overview of what the EU is. So the main research question that I looked at, like I said earlier, is what effect public support has on the European Union. I ended up looking a lot at what effect public support has on individual nation states and their governments inside the European Union, and then kind of drawing conclusions from that to apply to the greater EU. And I used basically two major theoretical veins to look at this. The first is establishing trust between the public and between the government. So if you have all the countries in the EU have to be some kind of democracy. So there has to be some belief in the population that their government has some kind of legitimacy. And I looked at a theory developed by David Easton in the 1960s called diffuse support. And basically what this is saying is that when you have, this will be easier. So you have people, a population, and a government. And there has to be something in the middle here. And populations make demands on the government, and if the government doesn't reciprocate those demands in some way, address them, or take care of them, then there's no trust established here, and there's no reason for the population to come back to the government repeatedly. But if the government brings attention to the concerns of the population, we have this like cycle. So there's some kind of trust developed between the population and the government because of this. But something that Easton looks at is what happens when a government isn't able to address the demands of the population, like during a war or during an economic crisis, when they can't necessarily make everyone happy. What happens then? And that's where Easton comes up with this idea of diffuse support, that people have faith in the legitimacy of the government institutions themselves, and so they keep trying to modify the system within the system instead of going outside the system in like a revolution or something like that. And this kind of brings in Max Weber's idea of legitimacy and what makes a government legitimate. And he goes into a couple of different ideas. One vein of that argument is that you can have legitimacy through a legal construct. So like in the US, we have a lot of faith in our Constitution. And that Constitution, that's what we hold our representatives to. And so if our representatives aren't doing what we want them to, we kind of bring them back to the Constitution and be like, hey, you have to support this. Like you said that you would uphold the Constitution. And so we have a lot of faith in that, not necessarily the politicians themselves, but the government structure. And so that's one of the biggest types of legitimacy that Weber goes into that's really applicable in the European Union. And then I also looked at trust between social groups. And Europe is a big population, and there's a lot of different social divisions within that population. And one thing that I looked into was Benedict Anderson. He came up with this idea of what's called an imagined community. An imagined community is basically when you have a group of people that feel connected to everyone else in that group, even though they haven't met. So, for example, I am an American citizen. I have that kind of connection with someone who lives in Idaho that I've never met before. If I met on the street in Paris, we'd be like, oh, we're both Americans. Like, there'd be some kind of bond there. Even though I don't know everyone in America, and there's no possible way for me to meet everyone in America, I have that kind of bond with them. And it's imagined because there is no actual relationship, but it still is a community. So we have these nationalities, these groups, these communities that we construct, and then what happens when we come into contact with someone that is not part of that community. And that kind of gets into the last point of theory that I looked at, and that is a theory that was developed by Lane and Erison in the late 1980s. And that's the idea of cleavages and reinforcing cross-cutting cleavages. And these are cleavages between different social groups. So I'm going to draw on the chalkboard again. If you have a population here, this is like a nation, and we're going to divide it in half. And this half is Red Sox fans, and this half is Yankees fans. And they don't communicate very well. If you just have baseball, they don't like each other at all. But if you divide this further into, say, like religious groups, then you have Protestants here, Catholics here, and some Muslims in here. So then you have people who can communicate between religions based on their sports allegiances, and between sports allegiances based on their religions. So that's a way that social divisions can really help a country or a nation or this broader community become more cohesive, because they're able to interact with each other, maybe not on one point, but on another point. But that's broken down if all of the Muslims are fans of the Red Sox, or all of the Catholics are fans of the Red Sox and not the Yankees. That is called a reinforcing cleavage. So in that case, they wouldn't have any basis of talking to one another. So those are kind of the theoretical pieces that shaped my project. So this is kind of the broad framework that I used to look at Europe. And basically I divided it into two sets of comparative case studies. I started out with Germany and Greece, basically because they're on opposite ends of the economic spectrum. Greece is doing not so well, and Germany is doing much better. And then we have Belgium and the United Kingdom. And in Belgium and the United Kingdom, you have, in each of these countries, there's a lot of regional divide between the population. But Belgium has done a very different, or has a very different outcome from those regional divides than the United Kingdom does. And I'm kind of looking at how these issues, political development, economic durability, and actions in the European Union affect Greece and Germany, and then regional divides, linguistic divides, and political unity affect Belgium and the United Kingdom. So we'll start with Greece and Germany. And I realize this is kind of small print, but this is kind of what I wanted to look at. The top two in each of these boxes, those are numbers that show the level of optimism that individuals in these countries have for their economic futures. This data was taken from the Eurobarometer survey in the spring of 2011, so it's about a year old. And this is in Germany, and the red squares up there show the level of optimism that Germans have for their economic future. So only 15% of Germans thought that their economic situation could get worse in this year, since 2011, the spring of 2011. Whereas in Greece, we have 75% of people thought their economic situation would get worse within the next year. And that also is reflected in their opinions on their employment situation. So you have people who don't have very much optimism for the future in Greece, and people are really optimistic in Germany. And I kind of wanted to look at why that is, why people in Germany have more faith in their government to take care of their economy than people in Greece do. So in terms of political development and stability, Greece and Germany are both fairly young countries, in their modern form anyway. Greece had a totalitarian regime at the beginning of the 1970s that they kind of had to get over to get into the European Union. That has always been a goal of Greece's, to get into the European Union, but they needed to work pretty hard to get there from this totalitarian regime. So their constitution was only formed in 1974, and it's changed twice pretty fundamentally since 1974. So there's not a whole lot of political stability that Greek citizens can actually count on for the future going forward. And this is contrasted by Germany. Germany has something called the Basic Law. The Basic Law is basically, the equivalent in America would be our Bill of Rights. And the Basic Law in Germany has been around since the end of the Second World War. And the way it's written is that you can't amend it unless you get rid of it. So unlike our Constitution, which you can change through acts of the legislature and the population at large, you can't do that in Germany. If you want to change it, you have to get rid of it completely. So that gives a lot more stability to Germany and to German citizens, because they have these rights that their government has to protect for them. And also, just as kind of a side note, in political stability, this kind of happened after I had finished gathering data for this part of the paper, but Greece's government did kind of collapse last fall. In the fall of 2011, the Greek parliament voted no confidence in their government, which is basically, in a parliamentary system, the parliament can vote no confidence in the government, and that forces the government to resign and forces elections to occur again. So basically, the legislature voted themselves out of office because they had that little faith in their government's ability to do anything. And that speaks a lot to the political stability, or lack thereof, in Greece. And you see Germany, and Germany is very strong. You have Angela Merkel, and she's very well recognized throughout the EU as a leader in the European economy. So you have those two very different governmental structures, I guess. In terms of economic stability, Greece again is at a disadvantage. Greece had to work really hard, like I said, to get into the EU. They also had to work really hard to get into the EMU. They had to completely redo their economy, and They eventually did come into compliance with the EMU's policies, but they stopped there. They got there and they said, okay, we're good, now we can stop reforming and stop working on our economy. And that created a really false sense of security that when the economic crisis in 2008 started, Greece, their debts became unsustainable and it collapsed, which started this whole thing that you read about in the papers every day about how Greece is pulling the rest of Europe down. Germany, in contrast, was the basis on which the EMU formed the European Union. They looked at Greece's monetary policies and their currency policies and wanted to follow that. So Germany has a lot more stable economic system. Germany did have some economic problems when the reunification happened between East and West Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. There was a recession, but Germany came out of that through austerity measures that were enforced by the EMU. So Greece now is looking at the rest of Europe and is saying that austerity measures can't work, and Germany's looking right back at Greece and said, it works for us, why can't it work for you? And those are two very different economic climates. In the 1990s, the world was a little bit more stable than it is now, but that's one of the reasons why Germans don't have as much sympathy for Greece as we might think that they would. And then just in terms of actions in the European Union, I've kind of alluded to this already, but you have Greece that is not well respected at all. In the European press, they're talked about as a contagion and that Europe needs to build a wall around Greece to keep its disease from spreading, whereas Germany is seen as kind of the savior of the European Union and of the euro. So that's kind of what I looked at in Greece and Germany, and it just kind of shows how the Greek government hasn't really been able to take control of its own situation, and because of that, its citizens have lost a lot of support because its government, again, hasn't been able to respond to the needs and desires of its people. And so there isn't this cycle and there isn't this trust built between them. And so it's lost that, any kind of support or trust, whereas Germany has been able to maintain that. And even going a little bit further, because Germany was able to come out of this economic recession that it had in the 1990s through European enforced measures, the German people have a little bit more faith in the legitimacy of the EU and in the legitimacy of the EU's policies than Greek citizens do, because it's not working for Greece at the moment anyway. So I'm kind of moving on to the United Kingdom and Belgium. And this is kind of what I wanted to look at. These regional divides. In the United Kingdom, you have England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is kind of an anomaly in Britain just because of the Troubles, and so Northern Ireland is treated a little bit differently in the United Kingdom than the rest of the regions. But then you also have in Belgium, Flanders, and Wallonia. Brussels is in the middle, and that's the capital, and that's the only province that has any kind of real integration in Belgium. So, just kind of looking at this. In terms of the depth of the regional divides, I find it to be really pretty ingrained in Belgium. You have two different systems of living in Wallonia and Flanders, and they don't really meet at very many points. This is one of the biggest indicators of that I found was that in their media, it's completely separate. So you have really different radio stations and TV stations and even newspapers in Flanders than you do in Wallonia and vice versa. So there's a really big divide there. In Britain, the culture isn't quite so divided. There is the idea of a more traditional Scottish and Welsh and not so much English, but then Northern Ireland definitely. Those regions definitely have their own cultures, but they still communicate with one another. And one of the biggest reasons that I found that this is the case in both countries is because of the language divide. In Belgium, you have Wallonia and Flanders. In Wallonia, they speak French and only French. In Flanders, they speak Dutch and only Dutch. And this has a really big impact into any kind of communication within these two regions. It used to be that there was an elite class in each region that would speak the other region's language, but even that elite class has kind of gone away. And so that poses a lot of problems, especially in a representative democracy. Like, how is it supposed to function in that way when one region doesn't really even know what the other region is doing, at least on a population level. And then in the UK, you have pretty much everyone speaks English, or everyone knows someone who speaks English. There is a movement in Wales and Scotland to kind of bring their more cultural and traditional languages back into the public sphere. Like, Wales has recently declared its parliament completely bilingual. So Welsh is spoken in the Welsh parliament, but it's also conducted in English. So even though these languages are coming out a little bit more now, everyone still speaks English, everyone can still communicate with each other. And so that's a big help when you're trying to govern a country. And one thing that I find very interesting in Belgium was this. And these are political parties in Belgium. These aren't all of them, there are a lot of political parties in Belgium. But these are just some that illustrate this idea of the divide really well. So these are political ideologies, and these are the different different political parties in Flanders and Wallonia. So you have the Christian Democratic Party, who in general they have about the same goals, regardless of what region they're from. But these two parties don't really talk to each other, they don't work together, so they're two separate parties, and they're two separate parties within the Belgian parliament, or legislature, excuse me. And in Belgium you have a representation system called proportional representation, and that is when it's different than the US, because when people go to vote, the percentage of the vote that one party gets, that's the percentage of seats it has in the legislature. There aren't any like districting policies or anything like that. It's just the population votes, and if CD&V gets 5% of the vote, then they get 5% of the seats in the legislature. So as you can probably imagine, this creates a lot more potential for divide in the legislature, and we saw that a lot in the 2007 elections in Belgium, because they tried to form a government, I think 4 times, and it took 541 days for them to form a government after the initial vote was taken in 2007. So that's December of last year is actually when they put in place a new government, and that's only been 6 months, so hopefully it keeps going for at least another 6 months or so. And that was only at the request and at the demand of the EU. The EU said, okay guys, you have to get your act together and form this government. And I think most telling in that is that it was the EU that forced them to finally get together and form a government. It wasn't their population. The Belgian population was fine. They carried on life as usual, pretty much, without a national government. So that shows how much power has been devolved to, to the subnational governments. So the governments in Wallonia and the government in Flanders are very strong, and they don't really need the national government to help them rule in any way. So it didn't really affect the common citizens' lives very much when they didn't have a government. And kind of contrasting this to Britain, I know you can't read these, and it's really okay. I just wanted you to see how many parties there are in Belgium, and there's about the same amount of parties in the United Kingdom, but the main difference is that these 4 that are highlighted in yellow, those are the only country or the only parties that got more than 10% of the vote in Belgium. And those countries only add up to about 50% of the vote, which is a majority, but these countries aren't allied with one another. So all of these, these parties aren't allied with one another. So all these parties kind of had to maneuver, and that's why it took so long for them to form a government. Whereas in Britain, you have the Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrats, and those are really the only parties that matter very much, on a national level anyway. And those 3 parties made up more than 80% of the vote in 2007. So you have a really different voting demographic in these 2 different countries. So Belgium is a lot more divided, and the United Kingdom is a lot more unified. And one of the biggest things when you're trying to apply this to the European Union is that while Belgium doesn't have very much faith in its national government is kind of obsolete at this point. I mean, it's there and it does do things, but the regional governments really do most of the day-to-day governing. And this is really important in the context of the European Union, because the European Union is trying to give more power and more recognition to individual regions within countries. So they recognize Flanders and Wallonia, just as they recognize Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. And that, so Belgium has more faith in the European Union because they see them as a government that can actually help them, give them what they need, whereas their national government doesn't necessarily have the ability to do that. And then in Britain, that dynamic kind of adds another layer of complexity to their government, because you have Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland that have traditionally wanted some kind of home rule. They got that to some extent in the 1990s with Tony Blair. They each got their own parliaments, but they don't have as much power as they want. And the European Union is really giving them that power, not in all, but in parts of the European Union. For certain legislative processes, the subnational governments are placed on the same level as the national governments. So they can get, these regional governments that want some kind of autonomy can get it within the European Union, more so that they can get it in their own nation states. So that's kind of another layer that I didn't get to explore as much in this project as I would have liked, but I thought it was really interesting. But so, in conclusion, what does this all mean for the European Union in general? And basically what I found is that there's a lot of literature that questions whether Europe will become a European nation or whether it will stay these individual nation states within the nation. And as of this point, I don't really see the nation state going away. But I don't think that that really precludes the European Union from being effective. If you look at Britain, you have all these very defined nations within the larger nation state of Britain, but the Parliament in London is still very effective and still a very centralized government, and it's still able to conduct business very well. So even if the European Union has something like that, very defined nation states within its supranational government, if it designs its government right, it can still be able to govern pretty efficiently and govern over the sovereignty of these individual nation states. And I think the biggest thing is that Europe, to become a Europe or some kind of Europe, really needs to play up the similarities between different European nations. There's a lot of differences, but Europe has been doing a lot in terms of subsidizing education programs that will send people from one country to study in another European country. And so creating that kind of communication and the ability for these different nation states to communicate with one another, especially in the younger populations, will help them to become more of a European identity and European entity. And additionally, like, they have the Eurovision Song Contest, which is kind of like American Idol, but for Europe, on a bigger scale, and everyone watches it. And so, I mean, even that is creating some kind of reference point that people can dialogue off of. They have that common experience. And also, I think the European Union really needs to kind of play up its history and its legacy. While the EU as we know it today was in existence during the Cold War, its predecessors got Europe through the Cold War. It got Europe through the Cold War with its nation states intact. It brought Germany back together, and it pretty successfully united the East and the West back together after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the EU was really instrumental, or predecessors to the EU were really instrumental in rebuilding the European economy after World War II. So those historical legacies, I think that if the European Union plays those up a little bit more, they'll have more of this idea of popular trust in the government. And so when these economic crises do come along, like right now, citizens have a little bit more to base off of, like looking be like, oh, well, the government did this for us at this point, so we should give them at least another chance to prove themselves, rather than like leaving the EU, which is I think what most people are scared of, especially in light of Greece and Spain and Ireland and Italy and Portugal. So I think that if Europe still has a long way to go, but I think it has the ability to compete economically on a global scale. They do have the highest GDP of any if you're looking at it as a unified economic actor, it has the highest GDP in the world. So that's pretty significant, and if they can use that effectively, it has an ability to completely change the way we think about international politics and the nation state.